Now we come to a new chapter in the prehistory of humankind. We're going to talk in this part of the course about the origins of food production, that is, agriculture and the domestication of animals, a turning point in human prehistory. This, Lecture 13, will cover a variety of topics relating to this most catalytic moment in the prehistory of humankind. We'll begin by looking at the dramatic environmental changes that followed the end of the Ice Age about 15,000 years ago. Then we'll describe the so-called Mesolithic cultures, which developed out of earlier Cro Magnon societies in Europe, where the climate change perhaps had the most dramatic effect on humanity, where people had to adjust from glacial tundra to forest and coastal living. And after that, we'll travel to southwestern Asia and examine the Natufian culture, a hunter-gatherer society which flourished in a part of southwestern Asia which is much drier today than it was after the Ice Age. And then finally, we'll describe how a short, bitterly cold event, so-called Younger Dryas event, named after a polar flower, which happened about 11,000 years ago, brought major drought cycles to southwestern Asia and had momentous consequences for humankind. So this lecture covers a lot of ground. Time frame, about 15,000 to 10,000 years ago. A fairly short period of time by the standards of the chronologies we've had in earlier lectures. At the end of the Ice Age, we experienced massive global warming. Not the sort of anthropogenic global warming which is in the headlines now, but major environmental change. Way back earlier in the course, I talked about this constant transition from cold to warm and back to cold. What happened after 15,000 years ago was one of the warm-ups, dramatically fast. And within 6,000 years, the world's climate warmed up to near modern levels. This change is nothing unusual. It followed the long-term trend of cooling and warming, with slow cooling and rapid warm-ups, a pattern that's been repeated again and again over the last 700,000 years or more. Inevitably, these changes were especially dramatic in the northern hemisphere, close to where the great ice sheets mantled both Scandinavia and modern-day Canada, as well as other mountain ranges like the Pyrenees, the Alps, and the Andes. The great ice sheets of northern latitudes melted rapidly. The effect of this was to release huge amounts of glacial meltwater into the oceans. In response, sea levels rose rapidly. They rose not straight up, but very different ways in different places. Why? Because in places they were adjusting the Earth's crust, adjusted to the reduced weight of the water on the land. Earth movements changed it. The configuration of the coastline made a difference. But generally everywhere, sea levels rose until by about 6,000 BC, not years ago, BC, sea levels were basically at modern levels. This rapid sea level rise had a number of very important consequences for humankind. The first one is that it inundated continental shelves off the coasts of all the continents. By 11,000 years ago or slightly later, Siberia was severed from Alaska. The plains of Southeast Asia, which played such a major part in the first settlement of Australia and New Guinea, was flooded, leaving only the islands of today. England was no longer part of the continent. The southern North Sea was flooded. But most important of all from our story, the Baltic Sea came into being. But that was the result of the retreat of ice sheets. There are other changes too. Global warming brought major rainfall shifts in more temperate regions of the world. There was, at first, higher rainfall in southwestern Asia, in areas like the Jordan Valley and the Euphrates Valley and the Nile Valley. The Sahara Desert, once again, as we saw earlier in the course, supported shallow lakes and semi-arid grasslands, which were a paradise for hunter-gatherers and later cattle herders. Much of southwestern Asia, which today is rather open vegetation, was covered with Mediterranean forest. In Europe and Eurasia, the warmer conditions brought major vegetational and geographical changes. Focusing for a moment on Western Europe, as the Scandinavian ice sheets retreated, they retreated from northern Germany, exposed Denmark, exposed Sweden, exposed Norway. They left behind them a huge glacial lake formed of glacial meltwater. As sea levels rose, the sea flooded this lake, and it became the brackish Baltic Sea, a major player in cultural events of the time. The treeless steppe tundra of Western and Central Europe, which was so important in Cro Magnon times, gave way to birch forest by 9000 BC, and then to temperate, what is known as mixed oak forest, oak, ash, alder, lime, by about 7000 BC. These were major environmental changes. They triggered major shifts in human life. Why? Because within a few thousand years, the familiar, admittedly ever-changing glacial landscape and periglacial landscape vanished and gave way to a world of forests, lakes, shorelines, and rivers. Very, very different. You go within 5,000 years or less from basically an Arctic adaptation to a temperate adaptation. A major shift for hunter-gatherers by any standards. And it is a testimony to the flexibility and the opportunism and the intellectual power of modern humans that they adapted to it with brilliant success. In Europe, the changes for the Cro Magnons, or the successors of the Cro Magnons, were especially major. The changes in the environment were so fundamental that clearly many of the old strategies for hunting and gathering no longer worked. Just as happened in North America, the megafauna, much of it, became extinct. The woolly rhinoceros, the mammoth, the bison, these animals rapidly vanished and were replaced, or the forest animals who had existed before still thrived. Deer became important. Elk became important. Forest and cold-loving animals still were important in the diet. But the adaptation required very complex choices by people literally from one generation to the next. Until about 75 years ago, these people of this transition period, when the whole of Europe changed dramatically, were a black hole. We knew almost nothing about them. There was a school of thought, indeed, which said everything changed, the Cro Magnons vanished or retreated north, and it was empty. But then, in the 1930s, a series of researches in Scandinavia produced evidence that there were, in fact, a number of really quite sophisticated hunter-gatherer societies where people lived especially by lakes and shorelines and had adapted successfully to these new conditions. And in time, the word Mesolithic was coined to describe them. In old-fashioned archaeology, and you'll notice I haven't really used these terms very much in this course, there was the Paleolithic, or Paleolithic, the Old Stone Age, based on the Greek word paleos, which means old, and lithos, which is stone. And then there was the Neolithic, which is the new lithic stone, which is the first farmers. And now in the middle, they put the Mesolithic. Mesos is middle in Greek, lithos is stone, Mesolithic. I had a classical education. These things are easy for me. Not for everyone else, but they are. For classicists, this is simple. But seriously, these three terms aren't used very much these days, but occasionally you'll see them in the literature or people will refer to them, so it's worth mentioning. And the word Mesolithic is particularly useful because it sort of puts your radar on to these people who were adjusting to the very new conditions. There is no question, I think, that some groups became extinct. The changes must have been traumatic. Certainly the population densities in Western Europe were relatively small between the end of Cro Magnon times and the beginning of farming. A period of approximately 8,000–9,000 years. How did people adjust? Some groups followed the retreating steppe north. In other words, they just kept going. What were they doing? They were pursuing reindeer, who did not become extinct, and other cold-loving animals, as their predecessors had done for thousands of years. Their campsites have been found, most of them just transitory places, often by lakes where people have butchered reindeer or camped for a while, are found close to the Baltic Sea coast until about 11,000 BC. But then, soon after that, the climate kept on warming and they were forced to change their lifeways completely. Probably the culprit, ultimately, was forest. Europe, in medieval times, to jump way ahead, was covered, much of it, with dense primordial forest, mixed oak forest. Only teeny patches of this, mainly in Poland, survive to this day. And the rich lore surrounding this thick forest, peopled with beasts, with all sorts of magical beings lurking in the dark shadows of this forest, with its giant trees. Much of this forest was cleared before medieval times, and even more of it was cleared after that. But you remember, if you look at Roman Europe, the barbarians across the Rhine lived in a deeply forested land. Well, this mixed oak forest spread rapidly across Europe during this long period of glacial warming. And this really affected the landscape because forest hunting is extremely difficult because the game is dispersed and in many places, oddly enough, edible plant foods are rare. So, Stone Age groups of the time, the Mesolithic, emerging Mesolithic people, moved close to rivers and lakes, into clearings in the forest and sandy clearings, and increasingly to seacoasts where abundant and predictable foods were to be found. Inland, across Western and Central Europe, these people became forest hunters, living on the edge of lakes and clearings or along rivers where they hunted forest animals like elk and deer, took birds on the wing, for reasons we will talk about in a moment, and subsisted off plant foods. Unfortunately, we know almost nothing about these people because the only thing which survives are teeny stone tools. But even these archaeologists can work magic with. There is an example of a site in northern Belgium which comprises a scatter of stones around a hearth in one place, and a few feet away a boulder with a scatter of stones around it. And the Belgian archaeologist who studied it was able to show that at some point during this brief stay, a person had gone over, sat on the boulder, made some stone tools. Subsequently, a second person joined him, and made more tools, and then they made some bone tools from using the stone tools. One of those two stone workers was left-handed, and they showed this simply from the stone by looking at the direction of the flakes and reconstructing the flakes back onto the floor, onto the core, which is the most hideously complicated and dull archaeology you can imagine. Forget golden pharaohs. This is the real world of archaeology. Mind-blowingly simple, monotonous routine. But at this time we know the toolkits became lighter and more portable. And it seems there were none in this forest area of the elaborate bone and antler tools found and used, found in Cro Magnon sites and used by Cro Magnons. One reason was a major invention which probably had developed during the late Ice Age: the bow and arrow. You would think this was a very revolutionary invention. It actually wasn't, because really it's an extension of the spear thrower. And everything we see, say, in North America suggests the bow and arrow was very useful, but it didn't really have a revolutionary effect. The big innovation was that it enabled people to shoot animals from a larger distance, not that bigger, but enough where the stalking was a little easier. But it also enabled people to take waterfowl and birds on the wing. This, to you and I, may seem like a very difficult skill, but actually, with practice, you can do it. And this allowed people to eat a much wider range of meat. Stone tools became smaller as a result. Many of them small microliths. The word micros is small in Greece. Again, my classical education. But these served as barbs for spears and arrows. If you put a barb on a spear or arrow, when it penetrates the victim, it does more damage, obviously, than a simple spear point. So that was the forest people. Very simple, light population, very mobile. Along the lakes in the Baltic Sea in the north, Mesolithic societies were more sophisticated. They became very expert fowlers, taking birds, and fisherfolk, camping for long periods of time near swamps and along shallow river coasts where fish and birds abounded. We're very lucky in Scandinavia because there were so many swamps and bog and so many low-lying terrain areas that we know a great deal about these societies because organic materials like wood are well preserved. They found fishing nets, they found barbed fishing spears, they've even, as you know, in later periods, found entire corpses in bogs. And we know that these people depended very heavily on wood and fiber for fish nets, baskets, and traps. They were trapping fish like pike and spearing them in shallow lakes. And they were living in one place for much of the time. This was a very successful adaptation. By 7000 BC, some of these populations, they're known to Danish archaeologists as the Malemos people, after a site of that name. Populations of some of these Malemos sites had risen considerably in the most favorable locations, near estuaries and lakes. The result was something that happened again and again in later prehistory. Territorial boundaries became more circumscribed. There was conflict between groups. We know this because finds of war casualties in cemeteries. Probably they were fighting over domestic matters and food supplies. But the interesting thing about these people is their society got more complex. They adjusted a bit to greater crowding. And what's fascinating about this is that although farming was introduced a few thousand years later, before 3000 BC, many of the hunting and fishing practices of these people survived in common use into modern times, despite the introduction of farming within 1,000 years later, 2,000 or 3,000 years later. The important thing about this is that by studying modern folk culture, by modern I mean early 20th century and 19th century, you can get some fascinating insights into much earlier prehistoric populations. And an archaeologist at Cambridge University called Graham Clark pioneered this approach back in the 1930s. Let's now go away from temperate regions, having recognized these really major changes, and the changes in culture, adaptation to forest and lakes, and coastal living. Coastal living had not been big in the Ice Age as far as we know, and increasingly an emphasis on intensive fishing and fowling as a way of survival, as well as plant foods. People were moving away from the predominantly meat diets of earlier time into a much more diverse, intensified world. They were intensifying the food quest, which is an important point that comes up in the next part of the world where we go to. That is Southwestern Asia. Or if you want to use the rather ethnocentric European and American viewpoint, the Near East. Southwest Asia, at the end of the Ice Age, experienced benign global warming, which brought rather nice conditions. It brought warmer and wetter climate. The result? A spread of oak and pistachio forests over much of the region, which at the time abounded in lakes and rivers. And the nice thing about lakes and rivers here, the lakes particularly, is that we can get core borings from them down in the beds at the bottom and have insights into ancient climate change in this region, which, as you'll see, was very important. This was a rather favored area. But while the Cro Magnons were flourishing in Europe, there was only a very sparse population of late Ice Age hunters around here. And these people were adapted to rather dry conditions because during the late Ice Age this region was pretty arid. But now there was suddenly a bounty, particularly of nuts, fall nut harvests. These harvests of acorns and pistachios were critical because people could store the big surplus of these for the rest of the year. One of the major turning points in terms of the processing of food was the leaching and processing of acorns, which have a high tannic content and cannot be eaten without processing. Somehow they developed this processing just like they did in Western United States at this period, and this provided fairly large food surpluses. Now populations rose considerably at a time when food supplies were much more plentiful. The classic picture, more food, more people. Especially, and this is very important, in large river valleys like those of the Jordan and Euphrates. Again, you've got the pattern we had in North America, where people are tending to settle in the areas where food supplies were diverse and plentiful. They lived not only off the nut harvests and other plant foods like wild grasses, and I stress grasses, but they also subsisted off desert antelope, particularly the small gazelle, which migrated from one pasture to another in spring and fall. And they literally would wait, trap them, kill them. Lots of them. So good were the food supplies that in favored areas where several environmental zones like grassland and floodplain and forest were close to each other, that people settled on what are known as these ecotones and were so successful with their food storage and their efficient weapons that they lived in more or less permanent settlements which were almost as large as the farming villages which were to appear in a few thousand years. So you've got a sort of move towards sedentism, as it were, a pre-adaptation to a much more permanent lifeway. It's a very important point. This was an area where things were sort of getting set up for either a catastrophe or an innovation. The most successful of these people are known to archaeologists as the Natufians, the Natufian people, named after a site called Natuf. Now, I try and avoid using these technical terms here because it's very confusing, but this particular term is useful and we will use it again. These people did exactly what I just talked about. They particularly harvested nuts and wild grasses, which they harvested with flint-bladed sickles. We've got the sickle blades, and what's very interesting, that on the blade of the sickle is a silicon gloss caused by the friction against the stalks, so we know they were cutting wild grasses. Why do we know they were wild? Because we found the seeds. These people, like the Cro Magnons, dwelt in caves, but they also lived in open settlements during a period from about 11,000 to 8,500 BC. The largest of these settlements lay close to the boundaries between coastal plains or grassland valleys and more hilly zones. The result was that they could exploit a broad range of foods from more than one ecological zone while living in one place. This is an extremely efficient and effective adaptation. They buried their dead in cemeteries, where for the first time the skeletons show signs of social ranking. How do we know this, that some people were more important than others? The most important individuals lay with distinctive, unusual artifacts. For example, stone bowls, very difficult to make. They have to peck out the interior, a process that takes a long time. These were clearly symbols of status. But why do you need status? Because there was a need for the first time to maintain order in increasingly large communities, and also to make sure that food within these communities was distributed equitably. You see, people now are living closer and closer together. If you were Cro Magnon and you quarreled with someone, you could move away. When you live in a permanent settlement on an ecotone, where to move elsewhere is dumb, you have to have other systems and recourses to resolve disputes, and we suspect that leadership may have been the reason for this, that it helped consolidate things and make it work. This became very important later on, as we'll see, because after 10,000 BC, the Natufians and their neighbors were faced with increasingly drier conditions at a time when their population was expanding, a recipe for disaster. Droughts became more and more common, and both nut and cereal crops shrank, the wild ones, and permanent water became less plentiful. Now, these severe drought cycles in southwestern Asia coincided with a dramatic geological event in the north, which has important implications for us with global warming. A huge meltwater lake in northern Canada was trapped by glacial deposits, enormous one. Suddenly the dam broke, and millions of gallons of fresh water cascaded into the North Atlantic, flowed over the surface of the salt water, and shut down the natural circulation pattern of the Gulf Stream, where salt, warm water drops to the bottom of the ocean. The result, zap, probably within a few generations. As a result of melting of ice sheets, Europe was plunged for 1,000 years back into near glacial conditions. Just think for a moment, if you had a massive melting of the Greenland ice sheets as a result of humanly caused global warming, we really could have another ice age. Interesting thought. But the effect on the Near East here was drought. Severe drought. And this was a moment of truth. The forests shrank, population was still high, the natural yield of wild grasses, which they turned to when the nuts became less common, were less. What could you do to compensate? That's the question. And in the next lecture, we'll tell you what happened. Because with the Younger Dryas, it's named after this polar flower, you are at a moment of truth where population in much of the world is up at the limit. And in this lecture, we've surveyed some of the climatic changes which triggered this change. We've surveyed some of the ways in which people adapted to this new world. Briefly, this warming was interrupted by the draining of Lake Agassiz, as this lake is known, into the Atlantic. But in Southwest Asia, this moment when the circulation shut down and drought came caused a crisis. And this was the moment when agriculture began.